Welcome to Melbourne Conversations. Humanity and technology walk into a pandemic, a conversation with Tan Le. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne. My name is Jane McCredie and I'll be your host for the conversation today. We'll be taking questions throughout the event and we will hopefully get time to answer a few of them at the end. Please submit your questions via the YouTube chat or you can send them via email to conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. You can also subscribe to this Knowledge Melbourne YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. On behalf of the City of Melbourne, I acknowledge the traditional owners of that land, the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I think I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the San Francisco Bay Area, where Tan Le is joining us from today. Tan Le is an innovator, inventor and entrepreneur, a former Young Australian of the Year who fled a legal career to instead forge one in neurotechnology. Welcome, Tan, to this conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you, joining from San Francisco.
Before we really get into the meat of the conversation, what is neurotechnology?
So neurotechnology is an entire field covering so many different facets of technological innovation that revolves around neuroscience and the brain. It's an endeavor that seeks to create interfaces that connect with the brain, or implants or other technologies that seek to change or improve the function of the brain in some way. So it's actually quite a broad discipline. It's not just it's not limited to the work that we focus on, which is based on non-invasive technology. The field is quite broad and covers everything from nootropics, which are things that you consume, much like drugs and other types of pharmaceuticals, all the way through to software programs that seek to change how your brain works and how it responds to different types of neurological conditions, all the way through to neurostimulation, neuromeasurement devices, and then brain implants. So it is definitely a very broad field of technological endeavor.
What are some of the practical applications of those technologies that people might be aware of?
So there are so many. Here in the United States, we have some latest developments that the FDA has approved, which is quite interesting around drugs. So, we're all very familiar with software games, for example, and they're seen as being kind of bad for you. But in fact, the FDA has now approved some drugs, instead of drug-based interventions, some software that can be kind of prescribed as therapy to help with ADD, ADHD. So that's some of the new developments that people kind of can relate to. Something that we've done at Emotive is around brain-computer interface, so helping someone who may be paralyzed from the neck down, who is unable to communicate, offering them the opportunity to interface with the external environment, whether it be connecting with a smart home or moving a cursor on a computer screen, or something that we did a couple of years ago with a man who was paralyzed from the neck down for 27 years. He was able to drive a Formula One car around a racetrack using just his thoughts and machine learning algorithms. So there's quite a lot that is possible with neurotechnology today already.
And the field is
I'm sorry.
I believe you had a conversation with that man who drove the car. Tell us about that conversation.
Absolutely. So it was really quite incredible. I belong to a community that's part of the World Economic Forum called the Young Global Leaders. And Rodrigo Huber Mendez is also a young global leader, and we met at one of our summits in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And I didn't know about Rodrigo's feat with driving around on the track, but I was seated somewhat serendipitously across the table from him over dinner, and over the course of dinner, he was talking to somebody else because the table was so large. But at the end of dinner, I finally had a chance to talk to the person next to me who said, my goodness, this man had done something really phenomenal. He actually drove a race car with his mind. You've got to talk to him because you're in neurotech. And I said, absolutely, tell me more about it. And she said, oh, he was wearing this device that picked up signals from his brain. It was like a 14-channel system. And I thought, that sounds very familiar to me because we're one of the very few companies that really focus on brain-computer interface technology that has a 14-channel system that's very well known in the marketplace. And so I rushed out to try and find and meet Rodrigo. And luckily for me, he was waiting for his special transportation back to the hotels. And so when I met Rodrigo, I said, Rodrigo, I heard about, we didn't get a chance to meet at dinner, but I heard about you driving around the race car. And he looked at my badge and he said, Totally Emotive, I have been wanting to meet you. I actually used your technology. So we became instant friends. And it was really one of those moments that is very special in my mind because it's so inspiring just to hear about his story. He, as a young man, he and his brother was off to just to a local store, and he was hijacked. And so some people just shot him in the neck and left him for dead on the road in Brazil. And it was just an awful situation, so tragic for someone so young. But he has such incredible strength and resilience, and was able to not only overcome this adversity, but he's also been a really big champion for people who have special needs, and to really foster that respect for people and all of their differences. And so it was really rewarding for me to meet Rodrigo and to learn about what he had done with our technology in order to really help the cause around helping people understand and respect differences. So it was a very big campaign around Brazil, and this was one of the ways that they could showcase how powerful, how technology can offer a level playing field for everybody.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. Can you talk us through how the technology actually worked? What was happening that allowed him to drive that car?
Yeah, so the way it works is that our brain is made up of billions of neurons, and these neurons are constantly interacting with each other through chemical reactions. These chemical reactions emit an electrical impulse, and so when you think about the human brain and the electrical firing of the neurons, that's what you associate. It's kind of a bioelectric system, and what we have is a device that sits that you can place on the top on your scalp. So it's a completely non-invasive technology. It listens in, it tunes into the natural electrical signals that's emitted by all of this neural activity. And then what we do is we apply machine learning algorithms to decipher the differences in the brain patterns. So the way it works is that you train the machine learning algorithms to pick up the distinct fluctuations in the brain associated with a specific command. So let's say, for example, you're trying to drive the car forward. You will train the algorithms to pick up the patterns associated with the idea of you moving the car forward. So you'll imagine the car moving forward, and the machine learning algorithms will kind of pick up those changes in electrical fluctuations and associate those patterns with that command. So every time you think forward, it then moves the car forward. And so you can imagine it's a recursive system. So what you want to do is to be able to have a very distinct, very clear idea about how you think about move forward so that you can get back to that same mental state again. But it's also the machine learning algorithms has the ability to continually refine and improve itself based on how you use it so that it can get it becomes easier for you to activate those commands over time. And so both those we're learning and it's learning to the point where it gets pretty good. And so in Rodrigo's case, he associated different commands, the idea, for example, of kicking a goal in a soccer match, or you tasting some really delicious food, along with the thought of driving the book. Imagine, normally you could probably get by with just thinking forward, but because he's driving this car around a racetrack at fairly high speeds, he wanted to have something pretty robust that he could activate. So he wanted to associate lots and lots of similar ideas so that he would be able to get into that mental state relatively quickly in order to activate those commands. So when I talked to Rodrigo, he said that, he thought about kicking a soccer goal. He thought about, tasting something delicious. It was all sorts of really unusual ideas, which really worked well for him in being able to activate and get back to that mental state to activate those commands.
So the person using the technology has to train their brain as well to be able to use it effectively.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a bit of training involved for both you and the machine learning algorithms because, we are basically, our brain is a very advanced learning machine. And so there's always going to be that feedback loop. If you struggle, for example, to get to a desired command, you will kind of adjust your behavior accordingly to try and get to a better outcome. And so there's going to be that slight learning on both ends, and definitely there is a training process involved in it. It's not designed to be out of the box because unfortunately everybody's idea of moving forward, left, right, stop, it's quite different. Even though the idea of it is quite simple to express in words, to kind of convey it in your mind, we all have slightly different ways of visualizing that.
It raises questions for me about whether these technologies could be used for other kinds of disability. Could you, for example, have glasses that picked up the light spectrum that could then send signals to a visually impaired person's brain so that they could see with their brain, if not with their eyes? Is that a possibility?
In fact, there was some really fantastic work done very recently out of Australia, and that seeks to do just that. So the idea is to stimulate the occipital region of the brain, which is the visual region of the brain, along with a camera in order to help visually impaired people see again. And it is going down the route of clinical human trials. So I think that that field is really, really exciting. And you're absolutely right. The potential for these technologies to really have a transformative impact on people's lives is very real, and that's what excites most of us who are working in the field of neurotechnology today.
What I guess is perhaps a little bit more controversial is when it's enhancing abilities of people who don't have a disability. So when we're talking about enhancing cognitive performance or...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that as we think about the neurotechnologies that are used to cognitively enhance performance, and some of you who have been following this field may be familiar with the work that Elon Musk is doing. He has been very public in announcing his company called Neuralink that seeks to create a brain implant that hopefully will allow us to compete with AI in the future. And so that certainly has very clear aspirations of not just restoring function, but also to augment our capabilities. And I think that, once we get to that level of potential transformation of the species, I think there's certainly more ethical questions that we want to think about and address as a society. And I was very privileged to be part of a panel conversation just a few days ago at Tufts University alongside the philosopher, very well-known philosopher Daniel Dennett, Jeff Seibel, who's an entrepreneur and in his own right, but also he has been someone who has stewarded the BrainGate technology, which originally came out of Brown University, which is one of the front runners and the very early pioneers in brain implant technology that had already had very, very positive responses in human trials. And maybe even more than 20 years ago, I saw some incredible lives that were changed as a result of the BrainGate implant. And so that technology has now been donated, thanks to the generosity of Jeff Stivel, to Tufts University for stewardship, largely. And when you ask Jeff why he did that, a lot of that is related to the desire to ensure ethical stewardship of the technology, and understanding that this type of technology, when we're looking at brain implants, it's not just a matter of restoring function, which is something that we are all very excited about and is not particularly controversial, but it also has the potential to augment and enhance human capabilities. And that's where we really need people who are ethicists, who are philosophers, who are academics, who are people who are really active in the public domain to really think about these issues.
We might come back to the ethics a little bit later in the conversation, but I'm aware that this session is titled Humanity and Technology Walk into a Pandemic. And I think we should at this point give a huge shout out to the people of Melbourne who, at substantial cost to themselves, made incredible efforts to control this pandemic in recent times. And boy, what results have they achieved?
It is really phenomenal, and my family is in Melbourne, so I totally understand, what everybody has gone through over the last 2 months, or almost at this point. So it's been a long time, but the tremendous gains that we have for the community, not only for Melburnians, but for the rest of Australia, I think it's a really positive impact, and certainly it didn't come without a lot of sacrifice. So kudos to everyone for sticking to it and doing our part.
Absolutely. My family is also in Melbourne, and it's been at an enormous cost, I think, but what an achievement. What can these kinds of neurotechnologies do to help us through situations like this pandemic?
So I think that, one of the most obvious areas where neurotechnology could potentially help in this situation is around understanding and measuring mental health. So as we know, in the situation where we have people with very, very drastically different working conditions, having to really adjust to working at home, to having not only be a professional work of any area, to being a teacher as well, a child carer, a gardener, a housekeeper. I mean, we're doing it all now, which is quite different to our roles before the pandemic. And I think that, and also some people, unfortunately, are who have been victims of domestic violence are also really, really struggling in these circumstances where they're forced to be at home with people who are hurting them. And so I think that in this particular case, and then on top of that, the actual nature of work is changing drastically as well. There is considerable amount of challenge for everyone in figuring out how do we have that work-life continuum, if we don't want to use the word balance. How do we actually achieve that stopping point when you can roll out of bed and be right at your computer? There's no commute to the office anymore, and the day just kind of blends into each other. That certainly puts a strain on our mental well-being, and I know that a lot of organizations are really concerned about the mental health of their employees, and this is an area in particular where neurotechnology can offer a lot of advantages, because it's not reliant on people reporting in that they are struggling. A lot of the times with mental health, one of the biggest challenges is people recognizing that they are struggling and seeking help. And it's really helpful to have technology that can objectively measure and track this passively, so that help can be provided before it becomes a potential issue. And so, and often well before the person is aware that they are really struggling. And so this is some of the potential areas where neurotechnology can really offer a lot of advantages. One of the technologies that I covered in my book, The Neurogeneration, that I really love, and I think there's a tremendous potential, is in digital phenotyping. So the idea around digital phenotyping is that we spend a lot of time on our devices, whether it be our phones, our computers, keyboards, joysticks, all of these, but in particular, our phones have really kind of become an extension of ourselves. We're kind of using it as an extra memory bank. We're using it in so many different ways. And in fact, the way that we use our phone can be used as a digital phenotype to start to understand behavior tracking. And so let's say, for example, when you're normally in a healthy mental state, you will pick up your phone, use this particular type of app. But when you're starting to struggle with your mental well-being, you may start to pick up the phone and be a little more agitated. Maybe you pick up the phone more frequently. You may open an app and then close an app. You may leave certain apps open for a longer time. So there could be very subtle changes in your behavior that algorithms could very, very quickly pick up because there's a change in behavior. And this is the kind of work that is that's been pioneered and developed by a fantastic group at Mindstrong. And I think that this is, and their endeavor is all about trying to touch billions of lives. And so I think that type of work is really, really exciting and potentially quite transformative, largely because, the phone is something that we use every single day. And if we could use our phones in that way to identify when someone is in need, then there are lots and lots of applications that are already phone-based that can be introduced to provide that the interventions that people may need. And in fact, I've read some studies where it suggests that people are much more comfortable talking to someone, especially people who have some sort of mental health challenges. They actually find it easier to talk to someone over a chat bot sort of scenario compared to picking up the phone and going to talking to a real life person, because the effort to do that is considerably greater. And so there's certainly potential there to use a combination of digital phenotyping alongside other forms of interventions to really help in this case with mental health well-being, not just during the pandemic, but post-pandemic as well, because it really is a very big concern for us. And I would say mental health is one area that concerns a lot of people, but it's a specialized area. But if we look at what the World Health Organization has classified as being the health epidemic of the 21st century, it's far broader than just mental health. It's around stress. And I think stress is something that we all experience at some point during our working life. And it's really the epidemic of the 21st century. We are really struggling to understand and to manage stress, particularly in the workplace. And so this is something that I think could offer a lot of value and a lot of help to people all over the world.
How would it work in practice? Your phone would pick up that you're agitated, and would it send you a message saying you seem to be a bit agitated? Would you like to talk to the chatbot, or is that what would happen? Yeah,
that could be something that could happen. I mean, many of these technologies are still very, very early in building out the ability to accurately track this. And if you can imagine, when I talked to Tom Insel, who's one of the founders of Mindstrong, he's very very open in sharing some of the challenges. So if you think about someone who in a controlled environment, you can actually observe when someone is starting to withdraw from their device or changing their pattern. But once they really struggle and start to spiral into a depressive state, in fact, they will start to withdraw from their device. And so it becomes very difficult to also introduce applications that will work. And so there is going to be there still needs to be quite a considerable amount of work to figure out how do we use these technologies. But I think that what's exciting for me in this space is that it provides, if we can find an early enough marker for someone spiraling into a depressive state, then we can have a lot more opportunities to intervene a lot earlier than, for example, a suicide crisis call line, for example. So having someone call a crisis line when they're really in trouble, that works and certainly helps. And there's ways to escalate when someone's picking up the phone and talking to someone who's feeling those calls. But if you could have technology that's picking up these behavioral patterns far earlier, I think there's the potential to really have a lot of gains there. And so if we're saying how do we map a patient journey around that, I think it's still relatively early days. Here in the Bay Area, there are some companies that are already doing a lot of work around just applications where people who have self-identified that they need help can use a chat box and that then escalates to a real person to basically interact and start to get help. But I think with what Mindstrong is doing, the opportunity is around very, very, really early intervention, and then allowing you to create kind of a cascading degrees of assistance over depending on what you've identified, which is hopefully ends up being a far better way to triage and offer solutions for the patient or the individual before we call them a patient.
If you've just joined us, my name's Jane McCredie and you're watching Melbourne Conversations, Humanity and Technology Walk into a Pandemic with Tan Le. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne. We'll be taking questions throughout the event, so please submit those via the YouTube channel. Tan, our brains encode so much of who we are, our ideas and our emotions and our memories are all things that are happening in our brains. What are your earliest memories?
Oh, my earliest memory is about my boat journey to Australia. I was only a 4-year-old at that time, but I remember it vividly because it was the moment where it was such a pivotal moment in my life, and there was a lot of build up to that departure. I remember in the months that preceded us leaving, our family would have conversations about how important this journey was going to be for us. And even though I was really young, I don't understand, now I have a young kid and she's so carefree. I don't really understand how I was able to perceive at such an early age the gravity of what we were going through. But I certainly understood it. And I remember a few things. Obviously, that's not in any sort of chronological order, but I remember the boat. I remember the ocean. I remember saying goodbye to my father, who decided that it would be better for him to stay behind in case our family was captured. There would be someone who could care for us from outside the prison. And so he stayed behind and would follow in a later boat. I remember being rescued. So after 5 days and nights at sea, we were rescued by a British oil rig just off the coast of Malaysia. And I remember just looking up at this sky filled with stars. And in fact, they weren't stars because they were right up close, but they were the lights on the oil rig. And the thing is, when you're in the middle of the ocean, in pitch darkness, it is really, really dark. The sky and the stars up above, they're so far away. And so this moment was really quite incredible because you see all of these stars up close, and then the commotion on the boat where, the 161 people on board knew that we had a chance of being rescued. And so that was really there were a lot of memories from that boat journey. The other thing that I remember is on the oil rig itself, the first apple that was given to me by the men on the oil rig. I remember they were so handsome. Somehow, I guess my mom said, "Oh, these men are so handsome," because I don't know what handsome is, but I remember, they seemed really lovely. They had lovely smiles, and then they looked at us, and we were just. I remember just imagining if only they would give us this apple, and they did, and it just oh my gosh, the flavor that bursted on it was just unbelievable. So that those are the memories that are my earliest memories, and obviously I know how important they are in shaping your view of the world and your value system even later on in life. And so that critical period where, from infancy to about puberty, where your brain is just absorbing everything like by osmosis, that's really, really the time when, you just take it all in. So I definitely was very much shaped by that experience. And even though I was very young, I remember those were my key memories that I still remember from that time.
What do you think the impact of those experiences has been?
For me, I think what has been really wonderful for me is that I think I've carried with me a sense of abundance because I started with nothing. And so I don't feel that I have the same fears of having to start over with nothing, because that's where I started. There's a certain comfort around the fact that you've been at rock bottom and started over from scratch, and you made it through, and it's okay. So I think that has offered me some resilience as I go through life and the challenges. But I've also carried with me a deep sense of gratitude and a sense that I've been one of the lucky ones to have had that experience, because it has really shaped my perceptions, my values, and and the grit that I have in my everyday life and the drive that I have. And so as much as it was very challenging at the time, it has made me a stronger person, having gone through an experience like that. One of my favorite things that I often share is the moment that we landed in Melbourne, Australia. I remember walking down from the gangway from the aeroplane, because we were lucky enough to, after 3 months in a refugee camp, Australia accepted my family in as migrants and refugees. And as we were walking down the gangway from the aeroplane, my mother told my sister and I that at the bottom of the steps, you are going to touch onto very special ground, and that you should bend down and touch the ground. And I remember as a 4-year-old bending down and touching the ground, and then looking up to my mum and saying, "Mommy doesn't feel very special." And and then she said, "Make it special in your minds." And I think that my mum is someone who really understands those significant moments in life, and making sure that we remember to capture those moments, because they are the pivotal moments that will shape us. And it's really that mentality that has carried us through our entire life, understanding how important that moment was of stepping onto, the fresh start in Australia, this opportunity to start our life over, and to make sure that we embrace it, all of the opportunities that it afforded us, and how lucky we were to have survived that journey and could start our lives over. And so, I think that has been really important as a recurring thread in my life, and the way that I see my sense of responsibility in making the most of the opportunity. And Australia has been such an incredible place for me. And so I consider myself a very proud Aussie, despite the fact that I now live in the Bay Area, because of what it has been able to provide for my family and I, and so many others. Our story is unique in some respects, but it is also has so much common ground with so many other migrants. We all share the same story of having come from somewhere else, adopting Australia as our home, and giving, that or everything, giving us Australia and the opportunity, everything we've got. And so, whilst it's my story, it's a common story that we all share.
I know you've said that in some ways you value that experience of being an outsider, because being an insider can mean collapsing your horizons. I found a very evocative statement.
Yes, I think that there is. You're so right, Jane. That my at least in my experience, this thread of constantly being an outsider, whether it be outsiders in our native land, when we were forced outside to leave Vietnam. When we arrived as migrants, we were outsiders because we looked different, we spoke differently, we ate different food, we didn't have the same history. And then, even as a woman in tech, I feel a lot of the times like an outsider as well. But it is something that I've come to appreciate as being my uniqueness, and you don't want to get settled into feeling like you've settled in and that comfort zone setting into you, because then you don't push the envelope anymore, and you get so wrapped up in your expertise that you kind of miss the disruptions that could be right there around the corner. So it is a healthy mindset to keep, and one that I've embraced for myself over the years.
We might get back to those thorny issues of ethics that we touched on earlier. I guess in one sense we do get very frightened about anything that is messing with who we are as humans, and Stephen Hawking said that artificial intelligence would destroy us as a species. But it's not entirely new, is it, neuroenhancement?
It's not new. It's something that we've been trying to do for thousands of years, whether it be tools that we've added to the mix, whether it's glasses that we wear to augment our vision, whether it's the phone that we use every day to augment our memory. All of these things are even education is an attempt to augment our cognitive abilities and to kind of create a platform that allows that to happen at scale. And so it's not something that's new, but what is new is the scale and the pace of the change. And that's something that we as a species have to grapple with. This modern kind of digital and information revolution is happening really, really quickly and exponentially, and it's accelerating. And so the pace of change that we're going to be able to see in neurotechnology and the kinds and the scale of the transformation is what I think is what's different this time. The evolution that's happened around cognitive enhancement has been going on for a very long time, and certainly not new. I do think that the ethical questions are something that we as a society needs to grapple with today because of the scale of the changes and the extent of the potential changes that it can have on our species.
I mean, we have such plastic brains, and we're gaining more and more understanding of how much our brains are modified by our experiences.
Yes.
It seems quite likely that the brains we have now would be fundamentally different from the brains our ancestors had thousands of years ago. So we have already changed the nature of our brains through the technologies we've developed. Is that right in your view?
It's absolutely experience dependent. The human brain is, unlike genetics and other parts of our evolution, which is designed to take a long time to change, the brain is nature's response to allow us to adapt quickly to the changing environment. And so it is very much an experience-dependent organ. And so even within your own life, your brain in your early years, where in your 20s and 30s, will be very different to your brain in your 40s and 50s and 60s because of just the different work that you're doing. The brain goes through a tremendous amount of pruning to optimize the networks to do what you do a lot of, so that you can be really efficient and effective at that. And so, even in the studies that some of the researchers have conducted with our technology, we found incredible differences in people's brains based on their experience of the world. So the more, even by like 1,000-fold, which is tremendous. That's a huge delta. It's a huge difference between someone who's spending very little time in a modern society and someone who gets to travel and see a lot of the world. The networks, the underlying networks, the dynamics of the brain in those two individuals that live today in the 21st century actually looks vastly different. And so, I can't even start to fathom how different our brains would have been 1,000 years ago, because there's so much variation even today, because this organ is built to be adaptive. It's built to continually evolve and adapt. And that's the beauty of it. Yeah, the plasticity is what makes it powerful.
Yeah, it's served us well. You've written about the creation of new neuroevolutionary pathways. Can you explain what that term means to us?
Yeah, so the idea is that as we start to interface more and more with the digital environment, now our brains are a biological system, and so it's an analog system, and the information that we have in the digital world is vast because it's networked and there's so much information out there. Many of us in the neurotechnology space that's working on the neural interface component of it is trying to create a bridge between this analog biological system and the digital world. And so as we start to create that bridge, there will be new pathways being created because we can start to interface with more information. We will feel more seamless with our environment. Let's say, for example, we have technology that can allow the machine learning algorithms to pick up when you're paying attention, when you're not. So imagine, or when you're feeling positive and when you're not feeling positive. Imagine your natural environment, like say in your office, it can dynamically change based on how you're feeling. That will start to evolve and change how you respond to your environment. So there will be new pathways being created just as a result of the changing environment, because one thing that we know really shapes our brain is the environment.
I can imagine that might feel a bit manipulative if your workplace starts changing around you to boost your productivity at work. People might not like that very much.
The thing is, if you notice it, then it's not effective. The thing is, a lot of these technologies, you won't even notice it. It will be so, it will just feel so seamless that it will just feel like it's an extension of you. So you walk into the room, the lights turn on, it knows, it recognizes you. When you're feeling a little tired, the lights brighten up a little bit so that it helps you stay focused because it knows that you still have another hour of work to complete, for example. It starts the coffee machine going so that you can have another dose of caffeine to boost you for the next hour. It will be very subtle things that it will do that will make your experience feel more seamless, and so you won't notice it. But you're absolutely right. It's going to change our neural pathways, and it's going to change how we evolve as humans, because we will become more connected with the environment, and we will have this symbiotic relationship. It won't feel like an us and the environment and an external environment. It will almost feel like it's an extension of you. very much like the way you feel about your phone today. It feels like you have to have it on your body, otherwise you're missing something. A lot of people have withdrawal symptoms when they put their phone away. Even though they know they shouldn't be charging their phone right next to their bed, they often have it right next to their bed because there's this withdrawal. It feels like it is an extension of you. And I think that as these technologies become really, really intelligent, and we can get to that place of humanistic intelligence where there is this sort of symbiotic relationship between the human and the environment, it will be subtle. The changes are not going to be drastic, so you're not going to immediately notice that it's invading on you, but it will eventually get to a point where you will be very dependent on that technology because it makes your day easier. We all want to be able to do more, accomplish more with less stress and with less effort. And if the technology allows us to do that, we're going to feel that it's a tool that will enable us.
Is there a point where we would become not quite human, but some kind of hybrid of human and technology? Or is that not even a relevant question?
I think we're already there. If you look at, I think that the hardest thing about understanding what's going on in the brain, I think, is because if I have a prosthesis, no one would even challenge that that's me. If I had, if I had to have a pacemaker put in my heart or something like that, any of those things, any of the organs aside from your brain that doesn't really fundamentally change your personality or anything like that, there's no rejection in terms of who your identity is. But if you take a drug that helps with your mental well-being, but then it messes with your behavior and it changes your personality, you will get rejected by your family and friends because the brain is actually the seat of the self and really the center of our personal universe. And so if you mess with that, I think that's where the challenge is. And so any sort of endeavor that seeks to modify our brain in some sort of way, I think the big test is going to be, will we seem like ourselves, not only to us, but also to the people around us. And as long as that is maintained, I think it will be very difficult. The ethical questions becomes very difficult. So let's say, for example, you take you use a drug-based therapy that helps to, improve and change your condition associated with ADD, ADHD, but then it has some unexpected side effects that changes your behavior, and you do something that as an unintended consequence of that technology. Is that you, or is that the technology controlling or changing and manipulating you? That's a really challenging question because we often think about agency and our ability to decide as being something that is reserved to that individual. But if we are augmenting ourselves with technologies that fundamentally change our perception of the world around us and things and our choices, then that becomes very difficult to know where things change. But I fear that there's not going to be a question that we will be able to kind of pull back from. Even today, even our relationship with internet companies, we know that it's pulling at our attention. It's those. Daniel Dennett said provocatively that those who control our attention control us. And I think to a large extent that's very true. And we have that situation now where some companies are able to control and capture the attention of a large part of the world. And so it is able to have a very large scale influence on what we see, who we interact with, the information that's presented to us. So we are being changed, whether we like it or not. The types of changes that we may end up seeing when the technologies are directly interfacing with our brains may be more pronounced and more transformative. And so that's why I think the space around neuroethics is one that so many of us are watching very deeply, and we all adopt the philosophy that we need to have responsible stewardship of this industry, because it can fundamentally change who we are.
Do you have a
There
personal
are,
line?
yeah, I think there's a lot of advantages to the technology. We know that neurological impairments affect 1 in 3 people in the world. So it's terrifying that one in 3 individuals will be impacted in some way by a neurological impairment. And so, and as we live longer lives, that question and that desire to really improve and preserve and sustain our brains will be even more pressing. So the question is not whether we need the technology. We absolutely need it. The question is, how do we steward, how do we become responsible stewards of that technology, and how do we navigate the conversation with the public in order to ensure that we continually evolve the space in a way that's responsible and reflects the values of humanity. And I think that's really the key that we have to ensure happens. And we need to get smarter about our understanding and our use of technology. Kind of, so many people say, "Oh, I love using Facebook, for example," and it has done a tremendous job in terms of the connecting us with our loved ones, especially for us, some of us who are, have uprooted ourselves, like me. I think it's been a phenomenal tool to do that. But at the same time, understanding that these organisations are fundamentally commercial entities, and they have different imperatives, and so they are going to have tools and create tools that will manipulate us in ways. And so being very cognizant of that and being very aware is important. And as this field of neurotechnology evolves, the same sort of questions need to be asked. What are the potential unintended consequences? How can we ensure that this does not create more disparity in our world? What kind of measures can we put in place to ensure that there's, inclusion in not only who gets to create the technology, but also the kind of even the data that's been amassed to drive these algorithms? Is it created in an inclusive way? Because as I mentioned before, the brains of individuals, just because of the experience and the context dependency, is so different. And so there's no such thing as a normal brain. And so if we understand that there is so much diversity in the brains in the world, in order to create technologies that really service everyone and not just the few, we've got to make sure that there's inclusiveness built into the way that we create the technologies, and also in how we allow for inclusion in our business models as well, so that there is the chance to co-create and not just being dictated to, because that is not a world that I want to be a part of.
Yeah, and that is a challenge when, as you mentioned before, the tech industry is very much a male industry, and it also excludes a number of racial groups to a fairly large extent, that it's then designing for the people who work in the tech industry rather than for the whole of humanity.
Yes, and that is something that I think we need to be very cognizant of. And those of us who are pioneering this space, who are innovators, who are inventors, we have a responsibility to think very deeply about our responsibility when we're ushering in new technology. It can't just be for the sake of creating new technology, but it has to be how does it service the community that we live in, and how can we be responsible stewards of that technology? So you can't just create something and then throw it out there and say, hey, you know what, I'm not responsible for that. I kind of just created the technology. You have to stay accountable. And I think that's that mind shift is already starting to happen. And I think that's a very positive step forward.
It is very easy for scientists and inventors to fall in love with their creations and be so focused on the challenge of, can I do this, that they can forget to think about those things. Do you think it's possible for external regulation to play a serious role in reining in what might be excesses?
I certainly think that there's always a role for regulation when there's the potential for harm to a large number of people, and certainly early on in an industry, you want to ensure that you follow best practices to nurture the innovation and to allow the innovations to flourish. And to allow the research to happen. But at the same time, we also need to be very, very thoughtful. And there are, I think, even though the people in neurotech, in our particular field, we are exploring a new domain, in many respects, there's already precedents out there in how we're managing and dealing with genetics and other sorts of biotechnologies that we can apply in a similar fashion. And so I would say that most entrepreneurs and technologists working in this space today, because we've had the benefit of having others who have gone before us, we're quite aware of the regulatory and societal frameworks that we're dealing with. And I think that it would, in all of the conversations that I've had, I would say that it really is a resounding feeling amongst all of them, and a real commitment, a deep commitment to making sure that the technology is created in a responsible way, largely because we know that we're actually dealing with the brain itself. And so it's something that it comes kind of hand in hand with what we're doing.
We're nearly out of time. We've had a couple of questions touching on, how can people inform themselves so that they're making conscious choices about the use of technology, when often what the technology is doing is not transparent to us as consumers. We don't know what the algorithm is that we're interacting with. And it's often not in the interest of a commercial provider to tell us that. So is there a way that we can be better informed in dealing with these technologies?
I think that a lot of I would say that the kind of the gap between an individual and the inventor or CEO of a company these days is quite short. The distance is quite short. And so as a member of the public, you have more power and more of a voice today than you ever did before. And so there is certainly, and I would say that most people working in the field now is becoming more aware. And so if some of you have watched Social Dilemma, for example, I mean, these technologies have come out, and there is an attempt to help the public understand how these algorithms work, in an attempt to help us become more informed. I think we will probably see a bigger groundswell of conversation around data, because the public needs to better understand how data can be used and how valuable it is. Right now, many organizations, we understand that there is some value in the data, but we don't know exactly what the value is. And so in some respects, it is an ongoing process of discovery. But the public needs to be a part of that conversation, helping to push that envelope rather than to be passive adopters of technology. I think that if you take the lens that you just want to be users of technology, then there's a higher likelihood of being taken advantage of. But if you take the lens that, we want to be co-creators of how this technology is going to evolve, then that's a very different lens. And I think that if we take more of that attitude, we will, we will have a much better outcome for everyone, and keep everyone honest. And that's the modality that I'd like to engage with. And I think that a lot of my peers feel the same way.
Thank you, Tan. We are out of time. So thank you so much for that mind-expanding conversation. I think we could go for another hour at least.
I really enjoyed the conversation as well. And hopefully for those of you at home that joined in, thank you for joining us. And please, feel free to reach out with more questions.
Well, thank you to everybody who joined us today, and don't forget to subscribe to the Knowledge Melbourne YouTube channel so you can stay up with these Melbourne Conversations events. There's also a link in the video description to a survey, and the City of Melbourne team would love to hear your thoughts about the event. The next Melbourne Conversations event will be in mid-November, and that will be a discussion about truth-telling and reconciliation, looking at what Australia can learn from the truth-telling processes in Canada and South Africa. For more information, visit the City of Melbourne website and search